Welcome, my fellow adventurers, to the Dragon's Lair. Today's episode is a fairly simple, yet important, introduction of myself and the podcast. I'll be going through my history with creative writing, my relationship with the craft and how it changed over the years, where I am now with it, and why the Dragon's Lair Writing Podcast came to be. Let us begin. According to my mom, it started with world building at a young age. I absolutely lived in my imagination and the endless possibilities it gave me. This inevitably led to a ravening hunger for fantasy once I had learned how to read, and ended up reading books like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and R.A. Salvatore's Drizzt novels in middle school. I reveled in the escapism that fantasy gave me. However, it wasn't until I read Emil Forman's Adventurers Wanted series that I wanted to become a writer myself. At the time, only the first book, Slathbog's Gold, was released, and I was invested in Alexander Taylor haphazardly joining up with a group of adventurers to slay an evil dragon. I wanted so badly to find Mr. Cluttershot myself and sign up as an adventurer. I have to be honest here, though. They're not groundbreaking books, but they did become the catalyst in my development as a writer at the time I was wondering what I could do as a future job. Rather introspective for a 13-year-old, but I was serious about it. I could have my adventures. I just had to write them myself, and thus began what has now been a 10-year odyssey of my own. Of course, dragons were going to be involved, as can absolutely be discerned by the name and logo for this podcast. I love dragons best when it comes to mythological creatures. Now, I do love other, more normal creatures, but when I discovered dragons, they blazed their way to the fore of my imagination, and have remained there since. And yes, there is a dragon of Dragon's Lair writing. His name is Karer, a plushie as old as I am who I always brought on my adventures. Inevitably, creative writing became an academic interest, and I was certain that I would pursue an English degree. After all, I had a natural inclination for fiction, enjoyed reading, and there were quite a few career paths that I could take with that degree. It would be something that I would enjoy, and who doesn't like making what they love to do their career? I would write every day, exploring new ideas, themes, and techniques over the years. I read articles, watched videos, joined forum discussions, and more recently began collecting reference books on the subject and have an entire shelf dedicated to just that. I fell in love with world building and reread The Lord of the Rings to see what details I'd missed, and took on the Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales, and other epic fantasies to explore the depths of this aspect of fiction writing. For the past 10 years, it all seemed very straightforward. But this is where the almighty narrator, in his powerful invocation of the words, would say that it was not straightforward. I had burned out on writing. The feeling of that emptiness to an intrinsic part of myself was vast, and it left me devastated. I took that as a good sign, that I hadn't fallen out of love with the craft, but even then it was a small consolation. Creative writing has been my everything for the past 10 years, and losing that drive to write... Imagine running at full speed, and then, quite suddenly, you trip over yourself. Instead of hitting the ground, however, you find yourself in a floating state of isolation, always reaching out, but never connecting for long. It was around 2 years ago that I had debated with myself on doing a YouTube channel, or perhaps doing a podcast. It was after starting a Twitter account, though, socializing, and then having the amazing opportunity to be a panelist twice at the Weeknight Writers virtual conference, that the podcast idea really started to gain traction. So, when I burned out, I decided to commit and use it as an opportunity to re-examine why I love this craft and speak about my experiences. I still love talking about storytelling. I still love discussing the different mediums to explore so many of its aspects. And I still find myself world building and full of ideas, even though I have now since switched from being an English major to an art history major. More than those things, however, is that I want this podcast to become a resource for other writers. I believe that anyone of any age, skill, background, and level of success can gain something from my experiences and add to the conversation. The fiction genre is always changing, and I have found that there are discussions that need to be had that I don't believe have been explored and considered on fair grounds. I have some pretty big goals for myself in this podcast, and I hope you'll join me on this new adventure. Thank you for listening to the pilot episode of the Dragon's Lair Writing Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at DLW Podcast and at SM England Writes. You can also follow me on Instagram at DLW Podcast and SM England _Writes. This podcast is also available on all other podcasting platforms, including YouTube. At the moment, however, Apple Podcasts and Overcast are still pending approval for the podcast, but that should be resolved fairly soon. The episode art was done by my good friend Anna Linne, who can be found as at Anna Linne GH, spelled ANNALYNNEGH, on Twitter. The music for today's episode comes free to use from tabletopaudio.com. Tim is an incredible composer and sound designer who started this website in order to provide anyone with epic, free-to-use situational background music to ramp up your immersion into a fantastical world. If you want to support the podcast monetarily, you can visit patreon.com/DLW Podcast and sign up to one of 5 tiers for extra benefits. But you can also support by spreading the word. Subscribe, share it on social media, recommend it to anyone who will listen, and leave reviews on platforms that let you. Thank you for joining me in the Dragon's Lair, and I will see you in the next episode.